I have returned to the New Mexico History Museum in Santa Fe, New Mexico. This is a great museum, and they currently have a special exhibition that sounds quite intriguing. This is an 1800s lithography press, used to print lithographs. This one was actually used in a very historic printing shop in Florence, Italy during the 19th century, but eventually ended up here in New Mexico. There are also some colored squares on the wall for some reason. The special exhibit I came here to see is called Looking Back, Reflecting on Collections, and it is about the nature of museum collecting and archiving. There aren't too many exhibits on this subject, but I have always been very interested in the inner workings of collections and museums, so this should be good, and there will be some cool artifacts that are not usually on display. On the left is a late 19th century Santa Fe fireman's cap, and on the right is the Museum of New Mexico's accession record ledger, used in the early days of this museum. That's a 1922 photograph of the first Indian Fair display in the old Armory building here in Santa Fe. That copper kettle was used at Cochiti Pueblo 150 years ago, and there's a corncob handle knife used to chop sheep's wool. The original Historical Society of New Mexico began in 1880, spearheaded by Territorial Governor L. Bradford Prince, who supported the collection of artifacts related to New Mexico's Native American and Spanish colonial history. Then Dr. Edgar Lee Hewitt, a very important archaeologist and educator, founded the Museum of New Mexico, from which this museum spawned, and was granted the use of the historic 1610 Palace of the Governors for the museum's displays. Here's a placard about the nature of collecting and the logic behind why people collect objects of value. These are wood-carved bultos made during the 1930s. These are replicas of historic religious figures that would be placed on altarpieces here in New Mexico churches and missions. Those are pine chairs from the 1930s, and above them is a carved wooden relief of the La Fonda Hotel bar scene from 1935. This is an impressive 1936 wood carving of the Spanish Governor de Vargas' entrance into New Mexico, 12 years after the Spanish were removed by the Pueblo Revolt. The WPA program of the New Deal provided lots of funding for the arts, including support for the documentation of regional histories and folk traditions across the country. Many subsidiary programs were also established. Here in New Mexico, there was the New Mexico Federal Writers Project and the FSA, which would photograph daily life across the state during this time. Here is a 1920 photograph of Canyon Road at Aquia Madre here in Santa Fe, taken by T. Harmon Parkhurst, who photographed northern New Mexico during that time. Parkhurst was one of the original designated photographers of the Museum of New Mexico, and this museum actually holds one of the oldest, largest, and most important photographic collections in the American West. Photograph portraiture has been widely popular since the advent of the daguerreotype. Of course, photographs allow us to see what long-gone people actually look like. Here's a bunch of old cartes de visites, which were 19th century calling cards that featured photographs of the family. The daguerreotype on the left features a woman in a wedding dress from 1851, and on the right is an 1860 daguerreotype of the archaeologist Adolphe Bandelier. This is a portrait of the Nestor Montoya family, sometime from the late 19th century, and this is a group of photographs of New Mexico Territorial Governor Octaviano A. Larrazolo's family, decorated with the hair of various family members, which was a common practice back then. Here are some more daguerreotypes, ambrotypes, and tintypes taken here in New Mexico Territory. Here are some photographs of a diverse group of New Mexico residents from the early 1900s. This one is sad. It was actually taken in New York City, and it shows a mother watching her daughter and son die in a tenement fire, taken by Arthur Fellig, who said he cried when he took this picture. There are some ranching photographs in this case. This is an 1858 photograph of Rocca Pia a Tivoli, Italy. They apparently have a large collection of photographs taken beyond New Mexico. Here's an 1848 photograph of the Alcazar in Sevilla, Spain, and an 1867 photo of a fortified mill at Plouharnel, France. This is plate 392 of Animal Locomotion, taken sometime between 1872 and 1885 by Edward Muybridge, who took photographic studies of people and animals in motion. His innovations helped develop the motion picture. There's an 1888 photo of the moon taken from California's Lick Observatory, and an 1863 photograph of the amphitheater at Pompeii. Here are some more historic photographs taken in Mexico and Massachusetts. This is a photograph of Romanian prisoners of war from the Battle of Stalingrad. They really have an impressive collection of photographs here. Most of these were taken in New Mexico. This was taken rather recently in the Bisti Badlands of northern New Mexico. I have been there, it's amazing. There's some photographs of Ship Rock in northern New Mexico, a very significant site for the Navajo, as well as a photo of Pueblo Bonito in Chaco Canyon, and a 1940s gas station in Bernalillo. And there's the balcony house of Mesa Verde. There's a 1926 photograph of Emma Goodseat and her Ford car on a road outside Taos, and an 1880 photograph of cowboys at a chuck wagon. Moving on, here are some guns, including a Derringer pistol similar to the one used to kill Abraham Lincoln, and the saddle pistol holster of General Thomas Fauntleroy. They also have this Frontier Scout 22 Colt revolver inside a New Mexico statehood 50th anniversary commemorative case. And this is a 1914 photo album by W.H. Dunton, featuring Taos artists, camping, and other outdoor activities in New Mexico. There are some unique shirts and garments from the 1960s, along with a handmade saddle from the Santo Domingo Pueblo. This 1914 Harley-Davidson was owned by Francis H. Harlow, a physicist who worked on the Manhattan Project at Los Alamos. He was also a collector of Pueblo pottery. He accepted this motorcycle in a trade of his 18th century Zia San Pablo storage jar. There's also one of his cool motorcycle helmets painted with Acoma Pueblo pottery designs. There's a 1940s Santa Fe Railway travel poster featuring dude ranches, and a 1920s photograph of actress Mary Bryan holding a New Mexico license plate. This case contains a menu from the 1949 75th anniversary commemorative luncheon of the Fred Harvey Company's Alvarado Hotel in Albuquerque. There's also some vintage Pueblo tourism postcards. Here's an exhibit on the legendary Pecos Bill, the giant cowboy. There's an articulated toy of Pecos Bill, and an original drawing of Pecos Bill and his two horses, Widowmaker and Funeral Parlor, seeking to add more scenery to Texas by pushing Kansas's scenery to Texas. And this is a Pecos Bill comic strip from 1937, called Pecos Bill Hits the Train, Looking for the Wild Bunch. Here are some books, one titled New Colorado and the Santa Fe Trail, and an 1855 book with illustrations and descriptions about western scenes and adventures. I'd love to go through that. And this book with the rattlesnake illustration is about an expedition down the Colorado River in 1853. They also have some presidential autographs. The one on the right is a private land grant concerning 156 acres here in New Mexico, signed by President Theodore Roosevelt. The one on the left is also a private land grant claim in Ohio, signed by President Andrew Jackson. That's his signature right there. There is a section on collecting as a colonial practice. Colonialism is a foundation for a lot of major museums here in America and Europe, and they admit here that many artifacts in this collection come from the exploitation of Native American historic sites. The whole ordeal and its ethics are definitely complicated. Here is a photograph of Red Cloud, the Dakota leader who was both the first and last Native American leader to win against the Americans during the Indian Wars. This is a Souvenir of New Mexico album from 1866. It was purchased by New Mexico architect John Gamin during the 1930s, but it was probably originally owned by a military officer in New Mexico territory, and it contains photographs of Navajos in prison during the Long Walk. These photographs of Native Americans were taken during a time when their cultures were very much threatened by extinction, which is a reason why photographers from the eastern United States came to document it and exploit it for the West potential. This is a photograph of future Territorial Governor George Curry with a Filipino man. During that time, he was the governor of the Samar province during the American occupation of the Philippines. This is a photograph of a Native American trading post in Arizona. This 1910 photograph was taken in Guatemala City, showing a United Fruit Company employee dressed in a Guatemalan military uniform. That says a lot. During the early 20th century, many archaeologists and anthropologists were based out of Santa Fe, especially Americans who went into Latin America studying the Mayans and Aztecs. So this collection accumulated lots of relics from Mexico and Latin America, although some have been repatriated recently. That shipping crate was used to bring Mayan relics by the archaeologist Sylvanus Morley. These are 17th century carved Spanish cedar columns that were brought to this museum from the Cathedral Basilica Metropolitana in Guatemala City by Sylvanus Morley. This is a Catholic prayer book written in Quechua, an indigenous spoken language in the Peruvian Andes, from 1891. Here is a collection of Latin American artwork accumulated by the International Institute of Iberian Colonial Art, which was based here in Santa Fe. That is a portrait of a crowned nun, or monja coronada, painted in 1769 in Mexico. These portraits were usually made to celebrate the lives of recently deceased nuns. And this is Santa Rosa de Lima, painted in Peru in the 18th century. This is the Nuestra Señora del Perpetuo Socorro, painted by Juan Coria, a mulatto painter in Mexico, sometime between 1617 and 1716. His work also graces Mexico City's Metropolitan Cathedral. And this is a painting of San Cristobal, painted in Alto, Peru during the 1700s. This painted pine chair was made in the 17th century, and it was used inside the historic Iglesia de la Merced in Antigua, Guatemala. This is an 1830s book about the antiquities of Mexico. It looks like it had illustrations of various artifacts. Here is some Panamanian gold from over 1,000 years ago. These are bultos and santeros, mini saint statues created for early 19th century churches and private residences. We saw a few recreations from the 1930s earlier. And here are some late 19th century Hispanic crucifixes. This old wood painted screen depicts various santos or saints. This was likely used in a mission church. The casual collection of these santos became big business here in New Mexico during the 20th century. Lots of people were seeking authentic ones from the 1800s or earlier, but a black market of fraudulent santos also developed in the santo trade. William Henry Jackson was a photographer on the Hayden geological expeditions of the 1870s and took some of the earliest photographs in the American West. He particularly spent a lot of time here in New Mexico. For example, here is a photo he took of the Taos Pueblo in the late 1870s. Here are some of his photographs from Yellowstone, including one of Old Faithful erupting and one of the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone, taken in 1872, the year Yellowstone became the first national park. This case contains information published by the Hayden expeditions. On the left is an 1870 book of photos taken along the Pacific Railroad from Omaha to Sacramento, and on the right is a photo album of the Santa Fe route. William Henry Jackson was also a sculptor, and he created this impressive model of the Taos Pueblo for display in Philadelphia's 1876 Centennial Exposition. He made two models, this one of the Taos Pueblo, and also one of the Acoma Pueblo, which they don't have on display unfortunately. This diorama is very impressive. This is a 200-year-old Chusa gaming wheel. Many folks in the Wild West days won and lost fortunes from this very wheel. This is an early 1900s Surrey carriage, and it belonged to the wealthy Manderfield family of Santa Fe for local travel, like trips to Albuquerque or Taos. This is pretty cool, a turn-of-the-century horse-drawn hearse. This one was used to carry bodies to cemeteries in Santa Rita, New Mexico from 1909 to 1919. This is a United States War Department map of New Mexico Territory from 1846, used during the Mexican-American War and American invasion of New Mexico. This is a bovine hide grape press from the early 1800s. I'm not exactly sure how that worked. I haven't seen one of these before. That is a piece of a ruined bas-relief from the courtyard of the Palace of the Governors. It was placed in the courtyard in 1935, so it certainly wasn't original. but it deteriorated over time after being exposed to the elements. This is a book press that was crafted by an inmate at the Penitentiary of New Mexico. And next to it is an automatic trap company mousetrap from the 1920s. This is a zozobra wooden string armature made in 1935. I guess this frame would be dressed up like zozobra. Of course, every year here in Santa Fe, they burn a giant zozobra effigy. Here are some Native American photographic portraits by Ben Wittick, taken in the late 19th century. They have a big collection of his work and articles in this museum. Here are some Native American crafts collected by Wittick, including decorated Apache moccasins and a silver necklace used as a prop in his photographs. There's an Apache knife and Wittick's Colt Action revolver. Here are some more Apache-made artifacts. That's a concept sketch by Sarah Laughlin for his cartoon book Bronco vs. Bicycle. And here are some Victorian-era bicycles. They were a quite popular mode of transportation during that time. This is a printing press used in Taos in the 20s and 30s by Spud Johnson, who published the Laughing Horse publication and printed it on this press. Here are some old copies of the Laughing Horse and Horsefly publications out of Taos. This museum also has a tremendous collection related to Gustav Baumann, an influential artist, woodcutter, and printmaker from Taos. Here are some of his tools, like his color code merry-go-round of carving tools. That's pretty cool to see. Here are some of his actual woodblock prints and studies. These are studies for Rain in the Mountains. So that was a fantastic exhibit. It showed the various types of collections and methods of collecting that museums do, and also highlighted some of the problems with past methods. I would like to see more museums try exhibits like this. It's not only an excuse to show off cool artifacts that are usually locked away in the archives, but they are also very revealing. Now I am briefly going to walk through the main exhibits of the New Mexico History Museum. Nothing has really changed since my last visit. I made a full tour of this museum last time, and that video will be linked in the description. Here is the section about the Spanish colonial era and the Pueblo Revolt. That mail wagon was used on the Santa Fe Trail. These are the Segesser hide paintings, mysterious 18th century paintings on buffalo hides, showcasing the Spanish occupation of New Mexico. That's a battle scene. Here is the Mexican-American War section, with relics of Generals Winfield Scott and Stephen Kearny. This exhibit is about the Long Walk and forced Navajo relocation. The American Civil War reached New Mexico territory. Battles were fought around here, and both the Union and Confederacy occupied Santa Fe at one time or another. One of the most famous Wild West outlaws, Billy the Kid, terrorized New Mexico during the Lincoln County Wars. This is a letter written by Billy the Kid to Territorial Governor Lew Wallace from prison. By the late 19th century, New Mexico was becoming a railroad tourist destination for Easterners, for obvious reasons. So the Fred Harvey Company, originally helmed by Mr. Fred Harvey, worked with the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad to bring high-class hotels, restaurants, and amenities to the American Southwest. These are Fred Harvey's personal date books, including newspaper clippings and other notes about his business venture. Fred Harvey gave that pocket watch to his son, and these are eating house passes for the Fred Harvey system from the early 1900s. That is a Fred Harvey Company code book. They were known for having a pretty strict code among their employees. Harvey girls worked the Harvey House facilities. They were young women from the East and Midwest who became famous for their hospitality. They were known as giving a civilizing touch to the Wild West. That's an old statuette of an early Harvey Girl uniform. Here is some authentic Harvey House tableware and silverware. They were pretty fancy. That's a cool map of the Harvey House hotel and restaurant locations. Sadly, many of them are gone. Here is some information about the various supplies required at the Harvey House hotels and eateries in 1908. This is a souvenir plate from the Montezuma Hotel that used to stand near Las Vegas, New Mexico. It was a luxury health resort that required an extra 6-mile train trip to get to. Herman Schweitzer worked for the Fred Harvey Company and collected Native American relics for the Alvarado Hotel. This is a correspondence with a Santa Fe jeweler about the topic. Here are some Navajo spoons and silverware. These were very popular tourist trinkets sold here in New Mexico during that era. Here is a carousel of vintage postcards sold by the Harvey Company. These are very cool. There were also newsstands and book stands at the Harvey House locations. Here's an original sign from one. This is a sign from the Grand Alvarado Hotel in Albuquerque, built in 1902. Sadly, it was demolished in 1970. It was a real travesty. The Alvarado Hotel also had an Indian building, designed by Mary Jane Coulter, where tourists could buy native-made crafts. The La Fonda Hotel here in Santa Fe was built in 1922. I actually got to stay there on this visit and have a separate video on that experience and history. That is a luncheon menu from the 1930s La Fonda Hotel and a Do Not Disturb print block made by the artist William Clark from the hotel. Various local artisans produced some very interesting furnishings for the La Fonda Hotel. Mary Jane Coulter was in charge of renovating the interior of the La Fonda Hotel, and these are some authentic furnishings designed by her. A lot of the original furnishings were destroyed and aren't presently in the hotel, so these are really cool to see. New Mexico had a difficult journey to statehood, but finally achieved the status in 1912. Here's the proclamation and pen used by President William Howard Taft. Pancho Villa invaded the town of Columbus, New Mexico in 1916, and this clock was in the train station there. It was shot and stopped by a Villista during the raid. There's a Villista's revolver and a cast of Pancho Villa's death mask. Here are some relics related to World War II's USS New Mexico. And here are some artifacts of the famous wartime journalist Ernie Pyle, who had that manuscript on the right in his pocket when he was shot to death just before the war's end. And this is an interesting painting of Uncle Sam and his 48 daughters, the daughters being the states. In front of the museum on the Santa Fe Plaza is the Palace of the Governors, one of the oldest buildings in the country and the record holder for being the longest public building in continuous use in American history. It was built in 1610 and was the seat of government for the Spanish, Mexicans, and Americans originally. It is now part of the museum. Actually, the museum's displays were first on display in there, but unfortunately, it was closed for renovations the last time I was here, and it is still closed for renovations a year and a half later. So I'll have to come back to this museum some other time when they finally finish and open it back up. So that was the Looking Back, Reflecting on Collections exhibit at the New Mexico History Museum. I thought it was great and really intriguing. If you enjoyed this video, then please like it, share it, and subscribe. Also consider checking out my other videos on tours of museums all across the United States. I also film videos on other historic sites, national parks, roadside attractions, and much more. Thanks for watching.